Everyone, we're continuing our journey through Manna and Mercy. And so last time we ended with kind of one of the most important keys of Manna and Mercy, the still point that God is love. And one way of reading the Bible is to understand the entire story as the Hebrew people, as Jesus and the disciples choosing between these two stories, the Genesis 1 way, the created in love, by love, and for love way, and the Babylonian way, the way of trusting in force, trusting in power, trusting in domination. And certainly it's not just limited to our faith story, right? It's kind of our story also that we often are torn between these two realities. And what we see when we read the scripture is that sometimes the people of God, the disciples, the early church, they choose the Genesis 1 way in a beautiful, life-giving, and at great personal cost way. And at times they choose the way of power and domination and force. And so it's not an easy choice. And it's also challenging because there are plenty of stories in Scripture that make God look very Babylonian, that makes it seem like God is trusting in violence, trusting in force. I mean, we have stories where God seemingly commands the armies of Israel to slaughter entire villages. And one of the first stories we come to where this premise, this point that God is love, is really called into question is the story of Noah and the flood. So I don't know if you can see this really well, but this is kind of Erlander's portrayal of Noah and the flood, where you have this kind of superhero-like being trying to scare the people into shaping up with overwhelming power and overwhelming force. And I don't know if you could read the words, but the God figure in that picture says, "Okay, everybody better shape up right now." And the crowds are saying, "Good grief, we better shape up." So one thing to keep in mind about the story is that all cultures, Middle Eastern cultures at the time, that there was a legend of a flood. It was just accepted as part of a story that you told. And so when you have an accepted story, the teaching point comes not by just repeating a story that everyone would be familiar with, but the teaching point comes with how you change the story up. And so what the biblical writer did in the story of Noah is added the part about the rainbow in the sky, God's promise to never again destroy the world again. And what's fascinating about that is that the Hebrew word for rainbow is also the same word used for bow, as in bow and arrow, as in a warrior's weapon. And so the imagery for the original audience would not just be kind of this pretty rainbow in the sky. The imagery would be God has laid down God's bow. And much, much later in Revelation, a book that is often used, I would say misused, to talk about God's coming violent judgment, the first image we have of God is in the throne room of heaven with the rainbow above God. And so right away, right off the bat in Revelation, we know what it's not about. It is not about God destroying the earth, because right there is the bow, the reminder that God has laid down God's weapon. The bow has been laid down. But the other interesting story about the flood is that the writer wanted to point out it did not work. That if the point of the flood was to get people to shape up. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 6. It reads that God was grieved that God had created humans because the heart of humans was inclined towards evil. And then after the flood, after Noah and the crew come off the boat, when God promises never again to destroy the earth, it says, "Never again will I destroy all of creation on account of humans, because the heart of humans is inclined towards evil." So one is in Genesis 6, and the other is in Genesis 8. So the reason for the flood, humans are evil, is the exact reason God says, "I'm never going to do it again," in Genesis 8. So one thing we learn from the story of Noah and the flood is that violence didn't work, not even for God. So then the story turns to something different. That God tries something else. God gives up on the way of the Babylonian gods, the way of force, the way of coercion, the way of scaring us, into acting right. And God turns into holy partnership. So the next key we have in Manna and Mercy is holy partnership and this idea of blessed to be a blessing. And it's the story of Abram and Sarah, where God comes to them and God says, go, leave your home, go to a land that I will show you. And I will bless you so that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And I think it's so worth pointing out here that how counter the biblical understanding, really the first understanding in Scripture of what it means to be a blessing, is counter to kind of the popular understanding that we have, right? That it is so common to think of blessing as some sort of special gift that I have, right? And I mean, the worst case examples are, TV evangelists who I'm blessed by my private jet and things like that. But it's this idea that somehow you are getting something because God blessed you with it. But the story of Abram and Sarah teaches us that the only reason God blessed them in the first place was for them to pass the blessing on. That any blessing we receive, sorry, that's my dog in the background. Y'all, my dog barks like crazy anytime anything happens outside. But the only reason that God blesses us is, for our sake, but also to pass it on to others, to use the gifts, to use the talents, to use the resources that God has given us to share with others. And so I think that has all sorts of implications for us in terms of what we use the things that we've been entrusted with, right? Whether it's our wealth, whether it's our expertise, whatever it may be, that whatever we have, that we have a calling to use what we have to make this world a better place, to bless others in some form or fashion. And that means that I can never, ever just use what I have just to benefit me. I always must be thinking about how I can use what I have, the resources I've been given, the access to wealth, the access to knowledge, whatever it may be, in a way to help somebody else, to bless somebody else. That God is wanting to always use us, to pass through us for the sake of others. And so that's the story of Abram and Sarah, the story of God choosing to enter into partnership with us, God choosing to bless us for the sake of blessing others, for passing it on. But remember when we talked about the story of Adam and Eve, that we have a free choice, that God invites us to being God's partners, right? But we can choose whether or not to say yes. Yes, I want to be God's partners. I want to be a blessing for the world. Or we can choose not to. We can choose to live out of greed, out of selfishness, out of a pursuit of power for ourselves. And so what we see then is when we choose to not be God's partners, when we choose to not live out of the reality of love, not live out of the Genesis 1 story, and instead to live out of the Babylonian way, well, that's kind of what theologians call the fall. It's sin, really. And I think sin is, it's one of those words that has all sorts of connotations. And at least for me, when I was growing up in youth group in Northeast Alabama, I thought sin was often taught to me in terms of specific acts as sin, right? And it was kind of this narrow list, like don't drink, don't have premarital sex, don't cuss. I would really be doing badly at that last one right now. But sin is more of a condition where we are living out of a reality where we're pursuing power, where we're living out of the Babylonian way of seeking to impose our way upon others through force, rather than living out of the reality of love, out of the reality of justice, out of the reality of shalom. And theologians can kind of talk about sin, and this is very much a part of our kind of my Methodist background, my Wesleyan background, as sin can be both personal and structural. So personal is I told a lie. I acted out of a place of greed, of pride. but also structural, that we have created systems that oppress, that hurt. And so, one of the most important keys of Manna and Mercy is to understand that sin is both personal and social. So, we have to read our scripture with both a wide angle and a zoom lens. What does our faith say to me personally, and what does it say to the world? It's a both and, not an either or. Because sin is personal, but it is not private. It is personal and it is structural and it is systemic. And so one of the first places we see this in Scripture is in Exodus, the story of Exodus. And this is the way Erlander portrays the plight of the Hebrew people in slavery in Exodus. It's this pyramid. And so if you notice at the top of the pyramid is Pharaoh, the godlike figure. And notice that he is upheld by the military, by superior force, and he's upheld by the priesthood, saying this is God's will. And you think of so many systems of oppression that those are the two things that uphold them: force and religious or theological justification. If you think of slavery in this country, if you think of the harm done to LGBTQ people in the name of God, countless examples. And here's the other thing about the pyramid, is the pyramids, they are allowed to continue and exist. They depend on the people here at the bottom doing the grunt work, doing the work that nobody else wants to do, for very little or no monetary return. That's how Pharaoh can live so large, right? And so if you start setting slaves free, then what's going to happen to this pyramid? It's going to collapse, right? That's why you have so many people in power who don't care at all, who don't give a damn about the national debt when we're giving tax cuts to people making hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of dollars. But all of a sudden are really concerned about the national debt when you're talking about expanding Medicaid, or raising the minimum wage, or providing relief to people who are suffering from the worst pandemic in 100 years. It's because they understand that for people to maintain their status at the top of these pyramids, they need kind of people on the bottom who are receiving less. That if the people on the bottom start receiving justice and equity and equality, then that becomes a threat to those who are on the top. And so they fight like crazy to prevent that from happening. I mean, think about everything that Pharaoh went through to stop the slaves from being free. All of the plagues that he was willing to endure to keep the Hebrew people enslaved, right? He was willing to suffer immensely to try to maintain the status quo. That the people at the top of the pyramid have a tremendous stake in maintaining the status quo. Now, I would love to keep talking about like the people at the top of the pyramid as if they are those other people, right? But I think this is a place where it gets really, really challenging, is because I'm at the top of the pyramid. I mean, by any category you want to look at, race, gender, sexuality, education level, socioeconomic status, access to wealth, access to savings. No, I may not be a millionaire or a billionaire, but I am very close to the top of the pyramid. I'm in the top 10% probably in this country. And if you look worldwide, I'm probably in the top 1%. And so I can't stand back from a comfortable distance and kind of accuse those who are at the top without implicating myself. That means that if I'm going to be faithful to the gospel, if I'm going to be faithful to the Manna and Mercy way of reading Scripture, I have to always be asking myself the question, what am I doing to make this world more just so that there are no pyramids, fully knowing that that's going to cost me something? Because for there to be a world with no pyramids and I'm near the top of the pyramid, that means I'm going to move down a little. It means I'm going to have to give up some of my privilege. And that's not an easy thing to do, right? That's a hard, hard thing to do. And yet, I think the invitation that we have, and while we keep talking so much about the Babylonian story and the biblical story, is we know that the Babylonian story, we know the story of power and domination and force and greed, we know that it ultimately leads to destruction and violence of others, but of all of creation, right? And we see this playing out. What are the consequences of living in a world of unbridled consumption and this just seeking more and more for ourselves? It leads to a world of climate change and a coming catastrophe. It leads to a world of extreme inequality, which breeds extreme resentment and can make all of us less safe. But that world feels so comfortable, right? Especially for those of us at the top of the pyramid. But the story of Manna and Mercy, the story of being God's partners, is really an invitation to trust. To trust that if I can let go of that privilege, even some of it, if I can be willing to give something up, and we have to, right? If we're going to create a world of justice and peace and shalom, we can't do it without giving something up. I was speaking to a church group actually last night about racial justice, and the group was all white, and I was kind of doing a very intro level thing, and I was talking about white privilege, and a person in the group made a comment that said, I'm uncomfortable with the term white privilege because privilege implies that you have something that you shouldn't have. And he went on to say, no, I what I mean is that there are absolutely advantages that white people have that people of color don't, but the solution is not that white people should have to give up that. That's what everybody should have. We should create a world where everybody should have those things. And I wanted to agree with him so badly. But the problem is if you look at who the majority of people are in positions of leadership, in business, in church, in politics, in whatever it is, historically, it has been white men. It's been people like me, straight white men. And the only way to create a more just world is if there are fewer white men in those positions. And that means, by necessity, some of us will have to step down. And that's not just true about positions of leadership and authority. It's true about wealth. It's true about schools. It's true about church life. It's true about so many things that as much as we would like for it to be the case where everyone can just have the same privileges, when one group over and over again has been at the top of the pyramid, and that pyramid has been built on the backs of other groups, there's no way to dismantle that without the people at the top of the pyramid being willing to step down and come down. And that's hard to do. And yet that's the very invitation that the gospel invites us into. It's the challenge that the gospel asks of us, to be willing to come down off the top of the pyramid. All right, thanks so much, everyone. In terms of tips for teaching this part of Manna and Mercy, I think this is a part where you can really, really use Erlander's work. I mean, you can do a whole lot of just with this picture here. When you're teaching it in a retreat, you can even invite people to start coloring, right? That if you color in one of the slaves on the bottom and represent that slave becomes free, and then color in the ones next to it and next to it, and sooner or later you see kind of this imagery of what happens when, if the color represents removing from the pyramid, the collapse of the pyramid. But I think this is also such an opportunity to help people really, really turn inward and really focus on some uncomfortable things. That this is not the time to think of the people on the top of the pyramid as those other people out there. I mean, yes, certainly CEOs and like Wall Street and all that, sure. But it's also me. And my guess is it's most of us who are part of this Patreon, right? And my guess is it's most of the people in most of our churches. And so we have to get to a point where we help people to be willing to acknowledge where they are on the pyramid. And I think it's this thing that we humans have a tendency to do, where we like to compare ourselves to the people who are above us, right? Well, I'm middle class. I'm not a millionaire, but I have health insurance. I have a pension. I have a lot of money in savings that I've inherited. I'm a white person, and the average white family has 10 times the wealth of the average black family, right? We have to stop comparing ourselves to the people who have more and start looking at how we stand in the pyramid in relation to the whole. And my guess is that most of us are going to find ourselves near the top of that pyramid. And that means we have to be honest about that and acknowledge that and start doing the hard work of learning how to give some of that up. And this part of Manna and Mercy is an opportunity to invite people to begin exploring that. And I think one of the best ways that you can help people lean into that is if you are vulnerable and honest yourself. One of my kind of hard and fast rules for teaching Manna and Mercy is you only tell a story about yourself, about how you screw up, or about how you were challenged. You never ever tell a story about yourself where you're the hero, because I think that really, really helps people be willing to lean into the really challenging, hard stuff without being made to feel guilty or defensive, if you can model that behavior for them. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Take care.